Hello and welcome back. Today's lecture is going to be one of a series of lectures that is going to be about the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement, it's a very complicated thing to discuss, in large part because I think the civil rights era, just the idea of there's this one little time period of American history where we're concerned about providing, equal opportunity for minorities. I think that's just misleading. There's two problems with it. One, it's that there's been a struggle for this equality of opportunity in America amongst the minority classes in America since the founding of America all the way up until today. And so the idea that it just happens during one time period is wrong. And the other thing is we always kind of talk about it in terms of African Americans. I think both of those things happen for a reason. One, when we're talking about civil rights, we generally talk about African Americans, although it applies to all minorities, because African Americans are the largest minority and because of the unique history of slavery, right? Other minorities didn't experience that in America. And so when we discuss the civil rights movement, we will be talking about it in terms of African Americans, but please keep in mind that these things apply to essentially all minorities in America. And so the battle has been, fought on many fronts. The other thing about the time frame, we're going to limit the civil rights era to a specific set of years within American history. Now we do that because we just, we don't have the time to go back and talk about the civil rights movement from the 1500s all the way on, and so because it's a huge long process. We don't have that time, so I think most historians really try and trim it down too narrowly, and so they'll talk about civil rights era as that time period, essentially post World War II from the 1950s all the way through the mid 1960s, kind of ending in 1965 with the Voting Rights Act. I think that's way too narrow. And so we're going to expand the conversation a little bit further. And we're really going to go back to, I think, the first big step towards equality in American history, and that's the post-Civil War era. And so we'll kind of start with the freeing of the slaves, and then we will, through a series of civil rights lectures, we will go all the way up to roughly 1965, which is the Voting Rights Act. Now, keep in mind there's still struggles, and we'll hit on that in other lectures for sure. But I think that's where we'll capstone it. So that being said, the first major advancement for African Americans in the United States is going to be the completion of the Civil War. Clearly, the Civil War is about slavery, and the North won. And because of that and the Emancipation Proclamation, all of a sudden now the slavery question is over. Right? Abraham Lincoln and the Republicans in the North are going to end slavery. Now, that's not as simple as one might suspect. And, it's a very simple moral question. Slavery is wrong, period. Now, it's a very complicated technical question because what you have is now 4 million former slaves, right, after the Civil War. What do we do with those slaves now? And that's complicated legally, right? Because you got to think, okay, so these former slaves, we're going to end slavery, but now what? It's not, in our minds, in our modern minds, we think, oh, well, we just treat them like everybody else. Well, you got to remember that wasn't necessarily a given after the Civil War. There were lots of people in the North and even some in the South that abhorred slavery and thought slavery was immoral and not Christian and this terrible thing, but they still believed in racial superiority of white people. And so there are people that supported ending slavery but didn't want to support equality. There were some people that were, we got to end slavery and we got to make everybody equal, and we got to do that today, right? And so there is this debate about what's going to happen. Well, generally speaking, the Northern Republicans see an opportunity here. They want to end slavery. They view these former slaves as political allies, and so it benefits them to, and not only end slavery, but to give them as many political rights as possible. Democrats, particularly Southern Democrats, they want to keep the status quo. And so, they're going to be opposed to the freeing of the slaves. They're going to be opposed to providing political rights to these former slaves. And so, well, what's going to happen? Well, after the Civil War, an interesting thing happens with the South. The South is essentially put under military control. And so, because of that, they're not in the Union. They have to meet certain guidelines before they come back and be a part of our country again. Well, that gives the Northern Republicans a real opportunity here. Because the South, the Southern Democrats aren't voting, they're going to be able to push through a series of Civil War amendments that are really going to benefit African Americans. That wouldn't have been able to pass if the South just was led right back into the Union. And so, what they're able to get passed without Southern Democrats, blocking them, are going to be referred to as the Civil War amendments, and those are the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And they're going to kind of take care of, okay, we've got 4 million slaves. What do we do? What do we do with them from here? So the first thing is obviously it's end slavery. Boom. All right, 13th Amendment, we've end slavery. We're going to end that forever. There's going to be no more slavery in the United States. And that makes sense. But then that leads to the next question. Okay, we've got 4 million former slaves. What do we then do with them? That's kind of up for grabs. And again, Northern congressional Republicans are going to push through the 14th Amendment, which addresses the next question, right? Are they citizens or are they not citizens? And so what happens is they push through the 14th Amendment. 14th Amendment, I think, might be probably the most important amendment in the Constitution, because it's kind of the amendment that makes all the other amendments have to be enforced. So the 14th Amendment does two things. It's important that you know both of them. The first thing is it makes anybody born here in the United States a citizen. And so no longer can states take away citizenship. That's super important because that means that they can't make others former citizens and any other citizens slaves. 13th Amendment also takes care of that. But it gives all of the slaves in the South citizenship. So the men and the women, the children, they're all going to become citizens. The second thing it does, and this is important, it applies due process in the Bill of Rights to the states. So before the Civil War, and this is crazy to think about this, and I think most Americans just don't know this, is that our constitutional protections in the Bill of Rights, freedom of speech, press, religion, assembly, petition, the implied right of association, which allows us to be a part of political parties, all of those could be violated by the states. Those freedoms only restricted the federal government, right? The national government. The state governments could violate that. And so if Pennsylvania wanted to, outlaw every religion but being, Quaker, they could do that. And that makes sense that they could do that because that's the only way slavery can exist, right? Those people, the Bill of Rights don't apply to those people. And so we want to squash that. And the 14th Amendment does that. And so that's why I say it's probably the most important amendment in the Constitution, because it makes sure that no level of the government can violate our freedoms that are listed in the Bill of Rights: speech, press, religion, whatnot. So huge thing here. And as far as the civil rights movement is concerned, all those former slaves are now given citizenship. Now, just because they're citizens and just because they have protections under the Bill of Rights doesn't mean that they can vote, right? The states have a lot of say over voting qualifications and things of that nature. And so, and a great example of that is women having the right to vote. Some states at this time point in time, women do have the right to vote, and others they don't. And so we're kind of afraid that that might happen to African Americans in these former slaves. And so the 15th Amendment just settles that question and says all former male slaves have the right to vote now. Female slaves don't. So and females won't have the right to vote in every state until 1920 in the 19th Amendment. So we talked about that in previous lectures. The former slaves, male slaves, now get the right to vote, and so at least legally now, we're seeing huge advancements. Technically, we don't need a civil rights movement because the Constitution says we've got to have to treat white people and black people the same. And initially during Reconstruction, the beginning phases, that starts to happen. African Americans register to vote, they vote. We're going to see a handful of African American Republican congressmen coming out of the southern states. Because remember, in some states like Mississippi and South Carolina, there's more black people than there are white people. And so we're going to see some advancements made. But that only is happening while the Northern military is still in the South. But once Reconstruction ends and the military leaves the South, all of a sudden we're going to start to see Jim Crow laws being passed. We're going to see, which promote segregation. And we're going to see the rise of the KKK that is going to keep African Americans from practicing their right to vote through fear and intimidation. And so, even though on paper these black men have the right to vote, without the Northern military there to protect them, that right is effectively going to be taken away from them. And so, all the way up until in 1965. And so, things initially look better, but then, the South will find a way around the protections that these amendments, I can never get that these amendments give them. So now, that's the political legal situation. And so things for in the short term get a little bit better, but then when the North leaves the South, things are going to get way worse, and we'll discuss that. That's on the political side. On the economic side, something else is happening to African Americans, and this is going to be absolutely devastating. And I don't think it gets enough attention from teachers and in textbooks, and that's going to be the economic system of sharecropping in the South. This is this is absolutely devastating for African Americans, and so we've discussed. Okay, we had 4 million slaves on Monday, and then we freed them, and now they're all free on Tuesday. And so that seems great, and I think we like celebrate that, and they teach you that in your third grade class, and they teach you that in your U.S. history classes in high school, and everybody's like, yes, the slaves are freed, and then we never, I feel like, thoroughly discuss what happens next, and what happens next is significant for the socioeconomic status of African Americans today. Because if you were a slave on Monday and you're free on Tuesday, yay, I'm so excited you're free. But now what? And this is super important because, think about it. Put yourself in the shoes of somebody that was a slave on Monday and free on Tuesday. What do you have? Nothing. Like, you literally have nothing. And so all of a sudden you don't own your own home. You don't own your own clothes. You probably keep the clothes that are on your back, but like that's probably all you have. You have no life savings. You don't have a family support system, right? Your mother and father, your brothers and sisters, your kids, they don't have anything either. So even a poor person in the South and a poor white person in the South has it pretty bad, but at least they have parents that may have a little bit of money that can help, or a little extra food, or, an extra pillow, or a shirt that you can borrow, or something. Right? Somebody in your family probably has a roof you can sleep under. And so at least you have some support. These former slaves that literally have nothing, right? And that's going to make them vulnerable. And we'll talk about that vulnerability here in just a second, right? The other thing that you don't have is an education or any kind of valuable skill set. And now, this is a generalization. There were African Americans that were skilled workers, blacksmiths, cord pointers, things of that nature, while they were slaves, but very, very few. So the vast majority of slaves essentially picked cotton or were domestic servants, and they have no skilled labor that once they're free that they can go hire themselves out for and make a good living. They don't have that. They essentially just can farm, right? And so, and they don't have any education. They were purposely kept from learning how to read and write, which is, again, another marketable skill because reading and writing might lead to slave revolts. And so, no education, no practical skill set that you can go make money off of, and no resources whatsoever. That means these former slaves are exceptionally vulnerable. And the former slave owners know that. The former slave owners, they don't want to pay people to work their fields. They feel like they purchased slaves and they purchased them legally, and that they don't want to have to double pay for somebody working in their fields, and so they're desperate to find a way to keep cheap or free labor in the South. And because these former slaves are so poor, right, they're vulnerable to being manipulated by these former slave owners. And see, and this is the thing that I think a lot of times that we, today in the 21st century really kind of lose sight of. We think of wealth as this like luxury that allows you to like live this lavish lifestyle and comfort and all that. That's not the real purpose of wealth and money and savings, right? The real purpose of having wealth is freedom. Right. If you have money, you have options. And so you can, you don't have to take the crappy job because you need it to pay the bills. Right. You don't have to work long hours. You have, the freedom to choose how you spend your time. You don't have to work three jobs to be able to make sure you feed your family. That's what wealth is about, and that's why it's important to save and to keep a nest egg, is so that you don't get manipulated economically. And so these African Americans have no wealth, and they're going to be easily manipulated by these former slave owners that do. And so you take this former slave, the only skill set that he really has is the ability to farm, and that makes him vulnerable, because even though he has got that skill set to farm, you got to have land. Does he have money to buy land? No. Can he borrow money from his family that won't manipulate him? No, because they don't have land either. He's essentially got nothing. And so these slave owners have a bunch of land, but nobody to work it. And so the slave owners come up with a system that is going to just be devastating to the African American community for the next 100 years, all the way up until World War I and the Great Migration, where they can move north and actually get a good job. And so that system is known as sharecropping. And sharecropping is essentially economic slavery because it is designed to keep African Americans in debt to the slave owners, and so to keep them stuck on a single plot of land forever. And not just them, but their kids and their kids' kids, to keep them dependent upon these slave owners. And here's how the system worked: the farmer says, the former slave says, "Look, I need land to grow crops to make some money." And the former slave owner says, "Look, I'll sell you some land, but you don't have any money. And so what I can do is I can rent you a plot of land, but since you don't have money, I'll want a percentage of your crop." And what's the former slave to say? Except, I don't have any other options. I don't even have enough money to get on a train and go north and try and get a better job up there. So I guess I'll have to do that. But the problem is you don't just need land to farm, right? You need tools. Well, does the slave have any money, former slave, have any money to buy tools? No. So the slave owner says, "Okay, I'll loan you my tools, but I paid for them. It's going to come at a cost. So I want another percentage of your crop." And then, the what's the former slave to do? Like, well, I don't have any other choice. I guess I'll go ahead and give you, another 10% of my crop. Well, you also need seed. Well, do they have money to buy seed? No. So another percentage of your crop. Well, I also need an ox to pull the plow. That'll be another percentage of the crop. So need a plow, another percentage, right? And then all of a sudden, you're in a situation where you're handing over a huge portion of your crop to these slave owners. And it's not like you plant the seeds and then the next day the crop grows and you just take it to market and sell it and use that money to go, pay for food and clothes. Doesn't work that way, right? You plant now and you don't harvest for months. So what are you going to do to feed your family in the meantime? That's right. You're going to have to take out a loan from your former slave owner to be able to pay for immediate needs, which means another percentage of your crop. And so at that point, at the end of the day, the sharecropper is turning over the majority of their crop, the vast majority of their crop, to the former slave owner. And the portion that they get to keep isn't going to be enough to keep them alive. And so every year they're going to go further and further and further into debt, which is going to perpetuate this, the perpetuate essentially slavery in the South. They're not going to be able to escape. The only way they're actually going to be able to escape sharecropping is going to be World War One, when all the white people in the North leave to go to Europe to fight, and businesses actually come to the South and are willing to pay for these former, the descendants of these former slaves to come up north and work. They're that poor that they literally can't afford to, even make it up to the north. And so this is devastating, not only for for these former slaves, but for the African American community as a whole, because it doesn't allow them to accumulate wealth. And so you essentially have the vast majority. Now, there are some African Americans in the North, there's some in the South that have escaped sharecropping. About 30,000 African Americans in America own land out of 4 million, so very few. But for the vast majority of African Americans, they're not accumulating wealth over time, right? Other immigrants and other minorities that have been discriminated against, they might be poor, but every generation they save a little bit more money. When they die, they hand a little bit something off to the next generation, and they're able over generations to escape poverty. African Americans, the vast majority of them, for 100 years, aren't going to be able to do that. They're not really going to be able to start that process until World War One. And so, and that's a big part of the reason why we have, higher poverty rates among African Americans today. Their families just have not been allowed to accumulate wealth as long as other, families in America have. So sharecropping, it's awful, but it's not the only thing that's happening terribly post Civil War. The next thing that we're going to see that's really happening to African Americans happens on the legal front, and that's going to be Plessy versus Ferguson. Homer Plessy is an African American in the South. He's a very light-skinned African American, and he sees that the 14th Amendment actually says that the African Americans should be treated equally to white people, and he wants to challenge some of the laws in the South that are segregating whites and blacks. One of those is the segregation of train cars, right? So the white population gets to sit in, these really nice train cars, whereas the black population has to, sit in these segregated. They're much lower quality. And Louisiana has some of the worst laws here, and so Plessy wants to challenge that. And so what he does is he goes out and he buys a ticket to be able to ride on one of these trains. And because he's very light skinned, he actually gets to buy a ticket for one of the white cars, and he's going to get on that car and he hands over his ticket to the ticket taker on the car, and he expects to get stopped. He wants to get arrested because that's the only way he could get his case to court. Well, the ticket taker actually just takes it and starts to move on, and because he's mistaken for a white guy. And Homer Plessy's like, "Oh, excuse me, sir. Didn't you know I'm black?" And so it's like this really weird situation. Well, it makes it to the court system, and it goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. And once the case gets to the Supreme Court is going to come down to a decision that is going to essentially allow and legalize segregation in the South. And what the Plessy versus Ferguson decision actually says by the Supreme Court is the Supreme Court says segregation is legal, right? So I've got here court ruled that separate but equal was not unconstitutional. That's a double negative, so it's hard to understand. What it actually means is separate but equal is okay, right? And so they say if you want to have a white car and a black car, that's fine, but they both need to be equal, right? And so, and their logic is this, that the government doesn't have the power to force the races to hang out if they don't want to. And so if your local government, your state or local government, the part of the government that knows you the best says, hey, look, our white people and our black people don't want to mix. And so we think that we're going to pass a law that our people want that's going to keep the two races apart. The Supreme Court says that's fine as long as both of those cars are, relatively equal. And that ends up becoming the law of the land. Now, what we know subsequently happens is that that's not going to be possible, right? That separate but equal will inherently be unequal, right? What do you think? The South is going to make the cars for the train cars for African Americans as nice as they make the train cars for their white passengers? Of course they're not. You think that, and so this opens the door for segregation and the Jim Crow South. Jim Crow just means the segregated South, essentially. And so we're going to have white bathrooms, black bathrooms. We're going to have white schools, black schools. We're going to have, white lunch counters, and black people are going to have to order their food at the back door. And it essentially legalizes that segregation in the South. And so this will be the law of the land for a very, very long time. And so all of these social restrictions start happening. We're going to see voting restrictions with poll taxes that, it's a tax to vote, which white people can afford and black people can't, or literacy tests where, black people are going to be given just absolutely ridiculous things to have to read and interpret that even educated people aren't going to be able to do. We're going to have whites only schools and blacks, black only schools, which is going to keep African Americans as uneducated as possible, which causes problems with those literacy tests. And so all of this essentially becomes legalized in the South. It also is going to embolden the KKK. We're going to see, the KKK kind of really forcing these things socially. Any African Americans that want to try and step up and challenge any of these restrictions based on the 14th Amendment, the KKK is going to, burn a cross in their yard, which is a signal like, it's a cross today. Tomorrow it might be your house with your family in it. And so, the KKK really becomes emboldened. Now, that will last essentially for 60 years until it eventually gets challenged in the court case Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954. Brown versus the Board of Education will, in fact, reverse separate but equal. And so this case is about, it's actually 5 students, but it gets called Brown versus the Board of Topeka, Kansas, because they list the 5 people, and Linda Brown is her last name comes first alphabetically. And so these kids want to go to a white school. As a matter of fact, most of them live closer to this white school than the black school. The black school, they've got to walk past the white school to get to it. They got to go across these, dangerous train tracks. It's quite a trek to get there. The white school's got a better building, so better facilities. It's got more qualified teachers. It's got better books. It's got a better library. And so these kids have to walk past this better school to go to a worse school. And they don't like it. And so what they recognize is, Well, the law says separate but equal. This black school is clearly not equal to this white school, and so and it's not equal in two ways, right? It's not equal in the actual state of the facilities, the amount that they pay the teachers, and it's also not equal in the outcomes of the school, right? The kids aren't getting as educated as the in the white schools, and so we're going to end up taking this case all the way to the Supreme Court. And Thurgood Marshall is who is this great civil rights attorney, it argues before the Supreme Court the obvious differences between the white schools and black schools, and it lists them, and it's on paper, it's concrete. These aren't equal, and he does an incredibly good job with that. And so, this is going to be one of the most important cases pushed out by the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which is really the legal arm of the civil rights movement. It's a group of lawyers that are going to be challenging segregation and discrimination through the court system. And so the court, who is a friend of the civil rights movement, right? The courts are going to be very friendly to the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. And they're going to essentially rule the obvious thing that segregation is, in fact, not legal, that separate but equal is inherently unequal. And so we can't, no more separate but equal in schools, right? And so this is only going to apply to schools, and this is the way our court system works, right? We're going to have to, if you're going to try and desegregate the South, without national legislation, if you can do it through the court system, it's going to be like kind of one part of society at a time, which takes forever, right? But then the Supreme Court makes a mistake. They make a mistake because when they say you have to desegregate, right? Yay, we got a huge victory here. But then the question becomes a practical question. Well, when, right? Desegregating tomorrow is just not practical, right? I mean, you can't take, no, even civil rights workers and lawyers know that you can't just desegregate the school overnight. If you've got a school that's got 1,000 kids in it, a white school with 1,000 kids in it, and a black school with 1,000 kids in it, if you desegregate overnight, like, who goes to what school? They can't all fit in one building, right? I mean, you got to figure out, how do you get kids from one to the other, and who goes where, and how do we figure out the busing, and how do we figure out the meals, and that's complicated. And so the Supreme Court recognizes that, and they give a deadline, but they don't give a concrete deadline. They say with all deliberate speed. Well, the question is, what the heck does that mean? For a civil rights worker, you think, okay, next school year, right? We got to figure this out for next school year. So, that gives everybody enough time to kind of prepare. It won't be perfect, but, it'll at least be something. And so next year, well, if you're a Southern governor and a segregationist, what's all deliberate speed mean? Whenever I get around to it, and I'll get around to it probably never. Right. And so we're still going to have a fight over schools because the Supreme Court opens up the door to Southern resistance with the phrase all deliberate speed. It's Chief Justice Earl Warren, who's going to be a huge advocate of the civil rights movement, that issues this decision. Great Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And so, kind of makes a mistake with all deliberate speed, but at least he recognizes that separate but equal is inherently unequal. And so the next big phase of the civil rights movement is going to be the Montgomery bus boycott. So the civil rights movement is attacking different segments of society, essentially all at the same time. But we're going to see, you go from one victory in the schools to now the next big challenge, which is going to be the bus system in Montgomery, Alabama. Montgomery, Alabama is, one of the most segregated cities in the entire country. The bus system there is what the majority of African Americans have to use to get to work, the grocery store, church, and the bus system is segregated. And so the way that the segregation works on these buses, the African Americans, have a essentially have to sit in the back of the bus. So the white section is up front, which is closer to the door. It's more convenient. And so but it's not just, I mean, there is a line on the bus that says, blacks here, whites up here. But as the bus fills up and the whites fill up the white section, and if there's no more seats in the white section and another white person gets on, the law on that particular bus is that the white person then goes to the next closest seat to the white section and can kick out whichever African American happens to be sitting there, and they have to stand up and make room for the white person. Well, the civil rights movement and the NAACP wants to challenge this in Montgomery, and so there's a strong group of black churches in Montgomery that are prepared to make this fight, and so they're really planning on challenging this. This is not a spontaneous. There's this myth that Rosa Parks was just tired one day and won't give up her seat on the bus and does this heroic thing. She does a very heroic thing, and a thing that's going to threaten her life and everybody she loves and cares about around her. I mean, this is wildly heroic, but it's not spontaneous. The NAACP originally didn't want Rosa Parks to do it. She was the secretary in the NAACP, and they had found another young lady to do it. But then, right before they were going to stage this protest, and challenge the segregation by having a black person sit in the white section, that young lady gets pregnant. And so as soon as she gets pregnant, they can't have her on the bus because they know that this person's life will be in danger and they don't want to do that to a pregnant woman. And so they kind of call it off. Well, it's at this point that Rosa Parks decides to step up. She knows that her bus driver is particularly racist, and she refuses to give up her seat to a white passenger on this bus. She will be arrested and ticketed. I think the fine's like $14. So it's not this like huge, I mean, back then that's more money than it is today, but it's not this huge deal. But once she gets arrested, now it can be challenged in a court of law. And so it starts the process to be able to challenge this segregation law, challenge it against the new board decision and the 14th Amendment. And so it can start that process. But in the meantime, her arrest leads to boycotts all across the city, right? The vast majority of the people using these buses in the South are African Americans. And that makes sense, right? The white community is more affluent in the South. They can afford cars. And some African Americans can, but the vast majority can't. And so they know that they have not only a legal battle on their hands, but an economic battle on their hands. And so all of these African Americans in Montgomery are going to band together and they're going to start a boycott. And so they're going to say no more black people on these buses, and that'll put economic pressure on these bus companies to essentially desegregate. The churches are going to act as kind of administrators here to organize the community. And for 381 days, a very unified African American population is going to stay off the buses. People are going to bike to work. They're going to, if a black person owns a car, they're going to carpool. They're really going to rally around this cause, and the NAACP will support them. The black churches support them, and a young Martin Luther King is going to kind of be placed in charge here. And so this is when Martin Luther King Jr. Really steps into the national spotlight. He's this great speaker. He's going to be highly educated, and becomes the face of the boycott in Montgomery, which will ultimately lead to him becoming the face of the movement across the entire country. Now, the boycott works. They're going to economically break the backs of the bus system. And so the boycott works. And the Supreme Court on the legal side will say that this policy violates the Brown decision. And so these buses will become desegregated. And so this is a gigantic win for the movement. Three important things happen. One, African Americans learned that through unity, they can economically put pressure on large parts of society to change. They get the legal expansion of the Brown decision that separate but equal is unequal, which makes it easier then in future court decisions. And the third thing is they now have their leader, Martin Luther King, who is a practitioner of nonviolent civil disobedience, which we'll talk about in future lectures, which is going to be important because the nonviolent part of that is going to be the thing that really makes the civil rights movement so effective. And we'll talk about why here in just a little bit. So clearly, this is a picture of Rosa Parks. This is clearly a recreated photograph. But it's going to be her bravery that allows her and her intelligence, right? You know, this mythical story of she was just exhausted and she didn't really know what she was doing. I think that short sells her here. She knew what was happening. She saw the wheels falling off the bus here, excuse the pun, when, you know, the original woman that was going to do the protest couldn't do it anymore. And she took it into her own hands and, you know, really, you know, outsmarted the bus driver that was driving. She targeted him on purpose and you know took this huge risk at you know great personal risk for her to desegregate the buses. So an important part of this movement too, and I think that you know again we'll talk more about civil disobedience in a future lecture, but this is nonviolent. And when she gets arrested, she doesn't resist arrest. She doesn't fight the cops. She's not yelling and cussing and spitting. She's dressed in her Sunday best, and all of this is done to be able to manipulate the press. The African American civil rights movement really recognizes that they need national legislation that just says no more discrimination. And to do that, they're going to have to get the majority of voters to agree with it. Well, the majority of voters are white. And so they've got to get the average white person on their side. And they know that they're not going to be able to do that if they're violent, if they're disrespectful, or anything, you know, anything like that. And so you see these workers, they're nonviolent, they're respectful, they're always dressed incredibly well. And that's really going to make them very, very sympathetic. I mean, look at this picture. Somebody's arresting Meemaw. I don't care if you're white or black or whatever. When you look at this picture, you just see, you know, like you see grandma getting arrested and nobody wants to see that. And so the movement is really good at using the media to their advantage to create sympathy. Right. The next major incident is going to really go back to Brown versus the Board of Education and is going to deal with the Little Rock Nine. The Little Rock Nine, so we're talking about Little Rock, Arkansas. It's going to challenge the all deliberate speed problem from Brown versus the Board of Education. And so, you know, the Little Rock, one of the things I think that gets overlooked when you talk about the Little Rock Nine, the Little Rock School Board is pretty progressive. They purposely want to challenge Arkansas and the Arkansas's governor over segregation. The governor does not want to desegregate the schools, right? He wants to keep the schools segregated. Well, the Little Rock board says, look, the Supreme Court says we have to desegregate. We're going to jump ahead of this thing. And they recognize that that's very complicated. And so what they do is they reach out to the NAACP and they say, hey, we want to desegregate our schools in Little Rock and we want your help. And they come up with a plan to essentially take a group of which will ultimately be the Little Rock Nine of young African Americans that are specifically picked to challenge this desegregation in Arkansas to get them into a white school. And now those 9 kids are specifically selected. They've got to have all kinds of qualities, right? They got to be incredibly intelligent because they're going to be going into a school where the teachers don't want them to be there. And so imagine if you're a kid going into a classroom where the teacher wants you to fail. How smart do you have to be to overcome that? I mean, you just have to be incredibly intelligent. So they're going to pick 9 kids that they think can overcome that. Because if they fail, right, if they don't graduate, then guess what the world's going to say? They're going to say, aha, look, Black people can't do it. They shouldn't be in white schools. Now, we know that's bogus, but that's what people are going to say. And so we want to avoid that. So we pick kids that we think can overcome that. We also pick kids that have the right attitude because, again, it's going to be one of those things. This needs to be nonviolent. We know that those kids, that when they get in that school, are going to be bullied. They're going to be spit on. One kid gets acid thrown in his face. And so, I mean, it's terrible. The parents are going to bully them. And the NAACP and the civil rights leaders and the school board recognizes that these kids have to have such strong character that they don't fight back. Because the second they fight back, the headline in the newspaper won't say African American defends themselves. It'll say African American attacks kids, students at school. See, they can't be in our schools, right? And so these kids go training, and they're going to go through all this training, and hopefully they're going to be able to make it through the system. And so the kids get all this training, and it's at this point that the Governor Faubus, who is absolutely opposed to segregation, essentially orders the National Guard out and turns them away from the school. And he says, look, the community has risen up and told us that they don't want these black kids in this white school, and so we can't guarantee their protection, so we're going to have to send them away. So all of a sudden, the kids, everything is shut down. These kids, they're not supposed to be able to go into this white school, and it's at this point that Eisenhower really recognizes that this is the federal government says that these schools have to be desegregated. The school board is trying to desegregate, and we can't have a governor flout the federal government. Remember from a previous lecture, Eisenhower does not want to get involved in the civil rights movement. It's too controversial for him, but he can't have a state essentially telling the federal government no. So he sends in the 101st Airborne, the heroes of Bastogne, right? Think about that. The heroes of Bastogne with machine guns, with bayonets attached, are going to have to go to the school to get these 9 kids in a school. I mean, that just is sickening to me, right? And so the day that they plan to get everybody in the school, that can't happen because there's not enough security there, and so the kids have to go home. And then eventually, once their safety can be assured, the NAACP and these students decide, well, okay, we're going to have to go to school now as we get escorted in. Well, Governor Faubus isn't done yet. He essentially calls out the white community and tells the white community, if you don't like what's happening, come out and protest. And so the NAACP knows about that, and they come up with a plan to counteract it. And essentially, they call up all these kids at home and they say, hey, we're going to come pick you up. Originally, you guys were all going to walk together, and we were going to get pictures taken and all that stuff. But we're going to pick you up and we're going to sneak you in the back door. Well, this young lady right here, Elizabeth Eckford, she doesn't have a phone at home, and so she doesn't get that call. So while the other kids are being snuck into the back, Elizabeth Eckford has to walk through the front door. And when she gets there, there's this huge crowd, right? And the huge crowd is vitriolic. They're yelling names at her, calling her racial epithets. They're spitting at her. They're making threats. Primarily the girls, right? Because it would look bad if the boys were beating her up. But they're essentially trying to intimidate her away from school. And so Elizabeth Eckford here, one of the most iconic images of the civil rights movement, gets taken. It's Elizabeth Eckford in her Sunday's best, remaining calm, cool, and collected, while the white community comes out, and you could just see the hate and anger on these people's faces. Particularly if you look over Mrs. Eckford's shoulder, you can see a woman screaming. That woman, I understand, later in life came to regret her decision, but still, it's terrible. And so this is another one of those images that perfectly encapsulates the movement. Nonviolence, right? She's calm, she's cool. You take a look at the hate she's enduring. She doesn't react. It creates a large amount of sympathy. It's going to take the 101st essentially to be at the school at all times to make sure that these kids are safe in this school. The Little Rock Nine, once they're in the school, they're still going to be bullied. One kid gets acid thrown on their face. One kid will eventually get expelled. The kid gets jumped and fights back, and so that kid's out. The rest of them will eventually graduate from high school. But if Faubus isn't done yet, after that year, essentially what Governor Faubus is going to do is going to shut down the high schools. He would rather shut down the high schools than allow these black kids to get educated in white classrooms. And so eventually he's going to have to reopen the schools. It doesn't work shutting down the schools, but it's a terrible thing he does. But all of a sudden now, black kids in the South are getting educated in white classrooms, and so it's a ends up being a huge step into the civil rights movement and the equality of opportunity. That, my friends, is where we're going to leave off for this lecture. I very much appreciate your time. We will pick up with Martin Luther King. I have a dream in the next lecture. Thank you very much.